When a woman steps off a dusty train in 1887 with nothing but a worn letter and trembling hands, she has no idea that the cowboy waiting for her will challenge everything she believes about love, trust, and second chances. What starts as a desperate arrangement between strangers becomes a journey that will test whether two broken hearts can heal each other, or if the shadows of the past will destroy their only hope for happiness. Some stories begin with love at first sight. This one begins with fear, desperation, and a promise that neither of them is sure they can keep. But sometimes the most beautiful roses grow in the harshest soil, and sometimes the gentlest touch comes from the roughest hands. This is the story of Clara and Jake, two souls who thought they were beyond saving until they found each other. Clara Mitchell pressed her gloved hands against the rough wooden seat of the train as it lurched to a stop at Willowbrook Station. Through the dusty window, she could see the small frontier town sprawling under the blazing afternoon sun. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. The letter in her reticule, worn soft from countless readings, contained the words that had brought her here. Seeking a wife for companionship and partnership. No romantic expectations. Just honest work and mutual respect. She had answered Jake Harrison's advertisement not out of hope, but out of desperation. Back in Philadelphia, her world had crumbled when her father's gambling debts had left her family penniless. Her stepmother had made it clear that Clara was no longer welcome, especially after refusing the advances of her stepmother's crude brother. The choice had been simple: accept Jake Harrison's practical proposal or face the streets. The train conductor's voice boomed through the car. "Willowbrook Station! End of the line!" Clara gathered her few belongings, a small carpet bag containing 2 dresses, undergarments, her mother's pearl hairpins, and a leather-bound book of poetry that had been her constant companion. Her hands shook as she made her way down the narrow aisle, each step taking her further from everything familiar and deeper into the unknown. The platform was nearly empty, except for a few ranch hands loading supplies, and an elderly woman saying goodbye to what appeared to be her grandson. Clara stepped down from the train, her worn boots touching the sun-baked wood with a hollow thud that seemed to echo her uncertainty. The heat hit her immediately, dry and intense, so different from the humid summers back east. She scanned the small crowd, looking for the man who had promised to be there. Jake Harrison. His letters had been brief and practical, telling her little about himself except that he owned a ranch, lived alone, and needed help managing his household. He had never sent a photograph, and she had none to send in return. They would be strangers meeting his promised bride and groom. "Miss Mitchell?" The voice was deep, hesitant, and came from behind her. Clara turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The man standing there was nothing like she had imagined. Jake Harrison was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years working outdoors. His dark hair was slightly too long, touching his collar, and his eyes were a startling blue that seemed to see everything. He wore clean but well-worn clothes. Denim pants, a cotton shirt, and leather boots that had seen countless miles. What struck her most was his expression. He looked as uncertain as she felt, holding his hat in work-roughened hands. There was something gentle in his eyes that contrasted with his rugged appearance, but Clara had learned not to trust gentle expressions. Men could be gentle one moment and cruel the next. "Yes, I'm Clara Mitchell," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel other passengers and townspeople watching their exchange with curiosity. Mail-order bride arrangements were common enough in frontier towns, but they still drew attention. Jake stepped closer, and Clara instinctively took a step back. He noticed immediately and stopped, his face showing understanding rather than offense. "I know this is awkward," he said quietly. "For both of us. Would you like to get something to eat first? There's a decent cafe in town and we can talk." Clara nodded gratefully. The thought of going directly to his ranch alone with this stranger terrified her. At least in a public place, she would feel safer.
"That would be nice, thank you." Jake gestured toward a wagon hitched nearby.
"May I take your bag?" When Clara hesitated, clutching her carpet bag closer, he added, "You can hold on to it if you prefer. I just thought it might be heavy." The kindness in his voice surprised her. During the long journey west, she had prepared herself for a man who would see her as little more than unpaid household help. Someone who might be demanding, perhaps even cruel. Jake Harrison's consideration was unexpected. "It's not heavy," she said softly, then immediately felt foolish for being so defensive about such a simple offer. They walked into town in silence, Jake maintaining a respectful distance. Willowbrook was smaller than Clara had expected, with a main street lined with wooden buildings that housed a general store, a saloon, a church, and various other businesses. The cafe Jake led her to was clean and modest, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. The owner, a plump woman with graying hair, greeted Jake warmly. "Jake Harrison! Good to see you in town. And this must be your intended." Her eyes were kind but curious as she looked at Clara. "Yes, ma'am. This is Miss Mitchell. Clara, this is Mrs. Patterson. She makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. Mrs. Patterson beamed and led them to a corner table. "Well, you two just make yourselves comfortable. I'll bring you some coffee and tell you about today's specials." Sitting across from Jake in the bright afternoon light, Clara could study him more carefully. His face was weathered but not unkind, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. His hands, resting on the table, bore the calluses and small scars of hard work. When he caught her looking, she quickly lowered her eyes. "I know this is strange," Jake began, his voice low enough that other diners couldn't hear. "Two strangers meeting like this. I want you to know that you don't have to decide anything right away. If you want to stay in town for a few days, think things over. I can arrange for you to have a room at the boarding house."
Clara looked up in surprise.
"That's very considerate, but I don't have money for."
"I take care of it," Jake interrupted gently. "I brought you here based on letters and promises."
"The least I can do is make sure you have time to decide if this arrangement will work for you." Mrs. Patterson returned with coffee and a plate of fresh biscuits. As she poured the steaming liquid, she chatted about the weather and recent happenings in town. Clara appreciated the buffer of normal conversation, though she was acutely aware of Jake's presence across the table. After Mrs. Patterson left them alone again, Clara wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, grateful for something to do with her nervous energy. "Your letters mentioned that you live alone," she said hesitantly. "No family?" Jake nodded. "My parents died when I was 19. Been running the ranch by myself for 8 years now. It's good land, and the cattle do well, but..." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It gets lonely, and I could use help with things like cooking and mending. I'm not much good at either." "What happened to your previous help?" Clara asked, then immediately worried she had been too forward. "I hired women from town occasionally, but it's a long ride to the ranch. Most of them had families to get home to." Jake took a sip of his coffee. "I thought about it for a long time before placing that advertisement. I hope you don't think less of me for it." The honesty in his voice touched something in Clara's carefully guarded heart. "I answered it," she said quietly. "I suppose we're both taking a chance." They talked carefully through the rest of the afternoon, sharing basic information about their lives while avoiding the more painful details. Jake told her about his ranch, the cattle he raised, and the small cabin he had built with his own hands. Clara shared sanitized stories about Philadelphia, her love of reading, and her skills with cooking and sewing. As the sun began to lower in the sky, Jake glanced out the window. "We should head to the ranch soon if you're ready. It's about an hour's ride, and I'd like to get there before dark." Clara's stomach tightened with renewed anxiety, but she nodded. She couldn't stay in the cafe forever. As they prepared to leave, Jake spoke quietly. "Clara, I want you to know something. I may not be educated or fancy, but I'm an honest man. I won't hurt you, and I won't force you into anything you don't want. We can take this as slow as you need." Looking into his sincere blue eyes, Clara felt a tiny spark of hope kindle in her chest. Perhaps this stranger wouldn't be the harsh master she had feared. Perhaps, in this wild frontier town, she might finally find a place where she could belong. The wagon ride to the ranch was peaceful, with Jake pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area. As they approached his property, Clara could see a small but well-maintained cabin surrounded by rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. It looked like something from a dream of home, and for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Clara allowed herself to imagine that she might truly be safe. Jake helped her down from the wagon with careful courtesy, and as they stood together in the fading light, Clara realized that her new life was beginning whether she was ready or not. The frightened woman who had stepped off the train was still there, but perhaps she could learn to be brave in this place where the sky stretched endlessly and a gentle cowboy promised nothing more than honesty and respect. Clara woke before dawn on her 3rd morning at the ranch, still disoriented by the unfamiliar sounds and smells. Instead of city noises and coal smoke, she heard roosters crowing and caught the scent of clean air mixed with hay. Her small room was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the pasture where Jake's cattle grazed. Jake had been nothing but respectful since her arrival. He had shown her around the cabin, explained the daily routines, and given her space to adjust. They shared meals and polite conversation, but she could sense his careful restraint. the way he avoided sudden movements and kept his voice gentle. He was trying not to frighten her, and his consideration both touched and puzzled her. She dressed quickly in one of her 2-day dresses, a simple brown wool that had seen better days. In the kitchen, she found Jake already gone, probably out checking on the cattle as was his habit. He left coffee warming on the stove for her each morning, along with a brief note about his plans for the day. Today's note read, "Working on the north fence. Back for dinner. There's bacon and eggs in the larder. Take your time settling in." Clara had never had such freedom in her daily routine. In Philadelphia, her stepmother had demanded a strict schedule and constant productivity. Here, Jake seemed content to let her find her own rhythm. She prepared a simple breakfast and ate it while watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The beauty of it made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. After breakfast, she decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly. Jake had built it himself, and his care showed in every detail. The walls were chinked tight against weather, the floors were smooth and level, and everything had been crafted with an eye toward comfort rather than show. The main room served as kitchen and sitting area, with a large stone fireplace that would provide welcome warmth in winter. Clara found herself drawn to a shelf of books near the fireplace. She had expected to find practical volumes about ranching and animal husbandry, but instead discovered a surprising collection. There were adventure novels by Jules Verne, poetry by Walt Whitman, and even a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. The books were well read, their spines creased with handling. "Find something interesting." Jake's voice came from the doorway, and Clara spun around, clutching the book of poetry to her chest. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry. I was just..." "You don't need to apologize." Jake stepped inside, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Those books are there to be read. I ordered most of them from a catalog in Denver. Gets pretty quiet here in winter." Clara looked at the book in her hands, then back at Jake. "You read poetry?" A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Surprises you, does it? Just because a man works with cattle doesn't mean he can't appreciate words." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks. "I didn't mean to suggest She trailed off, realizing how her assumption must have sounded. Jake's expression remained kind. "My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She made sure I could read more than cattle brands and ledger books." He moved to the kitchen and began washing his hands at the basin. "Feel free to read anything you'd like. It's nice to have someone here who might actually discuss them with me." The idea of discussing literature with this surprising man sent a flutter through Clara's stomach. "You mentioned your parents passed away when you were young. Fever took them both the same winter." Jake's voice carried old sadness. "Lost most of the neighboring families too. Hard times." Clara set the book down carefully. "I'm sorry. It must have been difficult managing the ranch alone. Neighbors helped where they could. I learned fast." Jake dried his hands and turned to face her. "What about your family? Your letters mentioned losing your father." Clara's throat tightened. She had been deliberately vague about her circumstances, and now she found herself torn between honesty and self-preservation. "He died suddenly. Heart trouble." The lie came easier than the truth, that her father had been shot by an angry gambler he owed money to. "And your mother?" "She died when I was 12. My father remarried." Clara turned away, pretending to straighten books on the shelf. She couldn't bear to see pity in Jake's eyes when she explained about her stepmother's cruelty. Jake seemed to sense her discomfort and changed the subject. "I thought I might ride into town later to pick up supplies. Would you like to come along, Mrs. Webb? Patterson was asking about you." The kindness of the invitation surprised Clara. "You don't mind the company?" "I'd welcome it." Jake's smile was genuine. "Besides, you should meet more folks in town. Willowbrook's a good place and the people are decent." That afternoon, Clara found herself back on the wagon seat beside Jake, this time feeling less like a frightened refugee and more like, what? A companion? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She had never been anyone's companion by choice. In town, Jake introduced her to the general store owner, the blacksmith, and several other townspeople. They were welcoming but curious, clearly wondering about the nature of her relationship with Jake. When the storekeeper's wife asked directly if they had set a wedding date, Clara felt panic rise in her throat. "We're still getting acquainted," Jake said smoothly, his hand briefly touching Clara's elbow in a gesture of support. "No need to rush into anything." Later, as they loaded supplies into the wagon, Clara found the courage to ask, "Do people expect us to marry soon?" Jake secured a bag of flour before answering. "Some might. But what people expect and what we do are two different things." He looked at her seriously. I meant what I said in my letters, Clara. I'm looking for companionship and partnership. If that leads to something more, well, that's fine. If not, we can still have a good arrangement. You don't want a real marriage? The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. Jake was quiet for a long moment. I want what's real to be real, if that makes sense. I've seen too many marriages based on convenience or desperation turn bitter. If we decide to become husband and wife in truth, I want it to be because we choose each other, not because a piece of paper says we should. That evening, after a quiet dinner, they sat by the fireplace reading. Clara had chosen the volume of Whitman poetry, while Jake read from a book about new cattle breeding techniques. The domestic piece of it felt foreign and wonderful to Clara, who had never known a household where evening time was for relaxation rather than tension. Would you read something aloud? Jake asked suddenly. It's been a long time since I've heard poetry read properly. Clara's heart jumped. I'm not sure I read particularly well. I'd like to hear it anyway. Clara found a shorter poem and began to read, her voice soft but clear. As the words filled the quiet cabin, she felt something shift between them. When she finished, Jake was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. That was beautiful, he said quietly. Your voice suits poetry. The compliment sent warmth through Clara's chest. My mother used to read to me when I was small. I always loved the sound of it. She sounds like she was a good woman. She was. Clara's voice grew wistful. She would have liked this place, I think. She always talked about wide open spaces and clean air. They talked late into the evening, sharing memories that felt safe to share. Clara found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in years, lulled by the crackle of the fire and Jake's easy conversation. When she finally excused herself to bed, she realized she had laughed more that evening than she had in months. As she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, Clara allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to truly belong here. Jake had made no demands on her, shown her no cruelty, asked for nothing but her company. Could it really be this simple? Could a man really want nothing more than someone to share quiet evenings and honest conversation? The thought was too precious to trust completely. But for the first time since arriving, Clara felt something that might have been hope taking root in her guarded heart. Outside her window, the vast sky stretched endlessly above the peaceful ranch, and, somewhere in the darkness, Jake slept in his own room, asking nothing of her but what she was ready to give. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight Clara Mitchell felt something she hadn't felt in years: safe. Whether that safety would last remained to be seen, but for now, it was enough to let her sleep peacefully in her new home. 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, a late spring storm rolled across the prairie with frightening intensity. She had never experienced weather like this, the sky turning an ominous green-black, the wind howling like a living thing, and rain coming down in sheets so thick she could barely see the barn from the cabin window. Jake had been out checking on the cattle when the storm hit. Clara paced the cabin floor, watching the lightning illuminate the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes. She had prepared dinner hours ago, but the food sat cold on the stove as worry gnawed at her stomach. What if something had happened to him? What if his horse had thrown him, or he'd been struck by lightning? The realization that she was genuinely frightened for Jake's safety caught her off guard. When had she started caring about this quiet, gentle man? When had his absence begun to feel like a missing piece of her day? Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the cabin windows. Clara jumped, her heart hammering. In Philadelphia, storms had been uncomfortable but manageable, with solid buildings and gas lamps to push back the darkness. Here, with only the thin cabin walls between her and the fury of nature, she felt exposed and vulnerable. A sound at the door made her spin around. Jake burst in, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. His hat dripped water onto the floor and his clothes clung to his frame. Clara rushed towards him without thinking. "Thank goodness you're safe. I was so worried." She stopped abruptly, realizing she had almost thrown her arms around him in relief. Heat flooded her cheeks as she stepped back. Jake's expression softened at her obvious concern. "I'm sorry I worried you. Had to get the cattle moved to better shelter. This storm's a fierce one." He began peeling off his wet jacket, his movements quick and efficient. "You must be freezing. Let me get you some dry clothes and hot coffee." Clara bustled toward the stove, grateful for something useful to do. As she poured coffee with shaking hands, she was acutely aware of Jake moving around behind her, changing into dry clothes. "Clara." His voice was gentle. "Are you all right?" She turned to find him in clean, dry clothes, his hair still damp and tousled. The concern in his blue eyes made her throat tight. I've never been in a storm like this before. The thunder is so loud and the lightning. Another crash of thunder made her flinch involuntarily. Without hesitation, Jake crossed the room and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. Hey, it's just noise. The cabin's solid. I built it to weather storms like this. His touch was warm and steadying, and Clara found herself leaning slightly into his strength before she caught herself. She had learned to fear men's hands, but Jake's touch felt different, protective rather than possessive. I know I'm being foolish, she said, looking down at her hands. I was afraid something had happened to you. Jake's hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. You were worried about me? The surprise in his voice made Clara look up. Of course, I was worried. You've been nothing but kind to me. I couldn't bear the thought of you hurt and alone in this storm. Something shifted in Jake's expression, a warmth that went deeper than mere gratitude. Clara, that means more to me than you might realize. They stood that way for a moment, the storm raging outside, while something fragile and precious bloomed in the space between them. Clara felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack, and for the first time, she didn't feel the urge to rebuild them immediately. The storm continued through the night, but they sat together by the fire, talking quietly while the wind howled. Jake told her stories about other storms he had weathered, making her laugh with tales of ornery cattle and his own early mistakes in ranch management. Clara found herself sharing memories of her childhood before her mother died, when her world had still felt safe and full of possibilities. What did you want to be when you grew up? Jake asked as they shared a late dinner by firelight. A teacher, like your mother. Clara's voice grew wistful. I loved learning and I thought it would be wonderful to help children discover new things. My mother was teaching me before she got sick.
What stopped you?
Clara's expression darkened. My father's debts. After he died, there was no money for anything like that. My stepmother, she had different ideas about what I should do with my life. Jake didn't press for details, but Clara could see understanding in his eyes. It's not too late, you know. Willowbrook's been talking about starting a proper school. Right now, Mrs. Patterson teaches a few children in her parlor, but the town's growing. The idea sent a flutter of excitement through Clara's chest. Do you really think they'd consider someone like me? Someone like you? Jake's eyebrows rose. You mean someone educated, well-spoken, and good with people? I think they'd be lucky to have you. Clara stared at him in amazement. You really believe that?
I believe in you, Clara. Jake's voice was quiet but firm.
I see how you think, how you care about things. You're stronger than you know. That night, as the storm finally moved on and left the prairie peaceful under a star-filled sky, Clara lay in bed, thinking about Jake's words. When was the last time someone had believed in her dreams? When was the last time anyone had seen strength in her, instead of burden? The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Clara woke to find Jake already outside, assessing any damage to the ranch. She prepared breakfast and was setting it on the table when he returned with news that all the cattle were accounted for and the buildings had weathered the storm well. You built this place well, Clara said as they shared breakfast. The morning light streaming through the windows made everything feel fresh and full of possibility. Had good motivation to do it right. Jake's eyes met hers across the table. A man builds different when he's building for the future instead of just for today. After breakfast, they walked together to check on the garden Clara had started behind the cabin. The storm had battered some of the young plants, but most had survived. As they knelt side by side, replanting what had been damaged, Clara felt a contentment she had never experienced before. Jake, she said suddenly, why did you really place that advertisement? I mean, the truth. Jake's hands stilled in the soil. Loneliness, mostly. I love this land, love the work, but at the end of the day, he shrugged. A man needs someone to share things with. Someone who cares if he comes home at night. Is that all you wanted? Just someone to worry about you. Jake looked at her seriously. I wanted partnership. Someone who could be happy here, who could make this place feel like home instead of just a house.
He paused.
I hoped for friendship. Anything beyond that would have to happen natural-like. Clara felt her heart skip. And now? How do you feel about the arrangement now? Jake's gaze was steady and warm. I think I got luckier than I deserved. You're nothing like I expected, Clara. You're stronger, smarter, and... He stopped, color rising in his cheeks. And what? And more beautiful, inside and out, than I had any right to hope for. The words hung in the air between them. honest and vulnerable. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that someone saw beauty in her, not just usefulness. "I never thought anyone would say something like that to me," she whispered. Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Then you haven't been around the right people." That afternoon, they rode into town together for supplies and to check on storm damage. As they helped neighbors clear fallen branches and assess damage to buildings, Clara saw how respected Jake was in the community. People sought his advice, trusted his judgment, and clearly considered him a good man. "Mrs. Patterson pulled Clara aside at one point. "You're good for him, dear. I haven't seen Jake this happy since before his parents died. He's got light in his eyes again." The comment stayed with Clara as they rode home in the evening light. Could she really be good for someone? After years of being told she was a burden, the idea that her presence might bring light to someone's life seemed almost too wonderful to believe. That night, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The storm had left the air clean and fresh, and the beauty of the moment felt almost magical. "Clara," Jake said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever you decide about staying here, about us, I'm grateful for these weeks. Having you here has reminded me what it feels like to have a real home." Clara turned to look at him, this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. "I'm grateful too. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope." The word came out soft but sure. Hope that I might actually belong somewhere, that someone might want me around, not because they have to, but because they choose to. Jake's smile was tender. "I choose you, Clara. Every day I choose you." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara felt the last of her defensive walls crumbling. Whatever came next, she knew that this gentle cowboy had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The frightened woman who had stepped off the train weeks ago was still there, but she was no longer in control. In her place was someone braver, someone ready to risk her heart for the chance at real happiness. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May, delivered by a rider who looked uncomfortable with his task. Clara was in the garden when she heard horses approaching, and something about the urgency in the sound made her stomach clench with familiar dread. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the cabin, where Jake was already speaking with the messenger. The stranger handed Jake an envelope and rode away quickly, as if he didn't want to be associated with whatever news he carried. Clara watched Jake's face as he read the return address, saw the way his jaw tightened and his eyes grew troubled. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. The past had a way of finding people, no matter how far they ran. Jake looked up at her, his expression careful. "It's addressed to you, from Philadelphia." He held out the envelope, but she could see he didn't want to give it to her any more than she wanted to take it. Clara's hands trembled as she accepted the letter. The handwriting was familiar, her stepmother's cramped, spiteful script. For a moment she considered throwing it into the fire unread, but she knew that ignorance would only make the dread worse. She tore open the envelope and read quickly, her face growing pale with each line. When she finished, she let the letter flutter to the ground like a fallen leaf. "Clara?" Jake's voice was gentle but concerned. "What does it say?" She couldn't speak for a moment. The words from the letter echoed in her mind. "You thought you could run away and escape your obligations, but Robert has tracked you down. He knows where you are, and he's coming to collect what's owed to him. You belong to him now, whether you like it or not." "My stepmother's brother," Clara finally managed, her voice hollow. "The man I refused to marry. She says he's coming for me." Jake's expression darkened immediately. "What do you mean, coming for you?" Clara sank into a chair, the strength leaving her legs. "Before I left Philadelphia, he claimed I owed him money for my father's debts. Said I could work it off as his wife. When I refused, my stepmother threw me out, but apparently they never stopped considering me their property." Property? Jake's voice carried a dangerous edge Clara had never heard before. "You're not anyone's property, Clara. You're a free woman. Not according to them." Clara's voice was bitter. "Robert convinced some judge that I signed a promissory note for my father's debts. It's all lies, but he has paperwork that says otherwise." Jake knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers. "Look at me." When she met his eyes, she saw fierce protectiveness there. "I don't care what paperwork he thinks he has. I won't let anyone take you away from here. You don't understand. Clara's voice cracked. Robert isn't just cruel, he's dangerous. He has connections, money, and he doesn't take no for an answer. If he's really coming here, then we'll be ready for him. Jake's voice was calm but steel hard. This is my land, Clara. You're under my protection now. Clara wanted to believe him, but she had seen what Robert was capable of when he didn't get his way. Jake, you're a good man, but you don't know people like him. He'll destroy everything you've built here to get what he wants. Let him try. Jake stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. When he returned, he carried a rifle and a gun belt. I didn't survive 8 years alone on this frontier by backing down from bullies. The sight of the weapons should have frightened Clara, but instead she felt a surge of hope. Jake wasn't going to abandon her to face Robert alone. He was willing to fight for her. There's more, Clara said quietly. The letter says he'll be here within the week, and he's bringing men with him. He's not coming to negotiate. Jake checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. Then we need to prepare. He looked at her seriously. Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She nodded, bracing herself. Do you want to go with him? Is there any part of you that thinks you should honor whatever obligation he claims you have? No. The word burst from her with more force than she had intended. Never. I'd rather die than go back to that life. Jake's expression softened. Then we fight. Together. That afternoon, Jake rode into town to speak with the sheriff and gather what allies he could. Clara spent the time checking their supplies and trying to keep her hands busy so her mind wouldn't spiral into panic. When Jake returned, he brought news that was both comforting and sobering. Sheriff Morrison says there's been a man asking questions about you in town. Well-dressed stranger with money to spend and a mean look in his eyes. He's staying at the hotel with 2 other men. Clara's blood ran cold. He's already here. Seems so. But the sheriff also made it clear that you're a respected member of this community now. If anyone tries to take you against your will, they'll have to answer to the law. That won't stop Robert. He's probably already working on bribing or intimidating anyone in his way. Jake's jaw was tight. Maybe, but this isn't Philadelphia. People here look out for each other, and they don't much like outsiders coming in making threats. That evening, they sat together on the porch as they had so many nights before, but the peaceful rhythm of their routine was broken by tension and watchfulness. Jake kept his rifle close, and Clara found herself starting at every sound from the darkness beyond their lamplight. Jake, she said suddenly, I want you to know something. He turned to her, waiting. These past weeks with you, they've been the happiest of my life. Whatever happens tomorrow or the next day, I want you to know that you gave me something precious. You showed me what kindness looks like, what it feels like to be valued and respected. Jake was quiet for a moment, then he reached over and took her hand. Clara, there's something I need to tell you too. She looked at him in the lamplight, seeing the serious expression on his weathered face. I love you, he said simply. I didn't plan on it, didn't expect it, but somewhere between that first day when you stepped off the train looking so frightened and brave, and tonight, sitting here knowing I'd do anything to keep you safe, I fell in love with you. Clara's breath caught. Jake, I'm not saying it to pressure you or because I think we might not have many more chances to say important things. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve to know that someone loves you just exactly as you are. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. I love you too, she whispered. I was so afraid to admit it, even to myself, because I thought it would be taken away from me. Jake lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. Nothing's taking you away from me, Clara. I promise you that. They talked late into the night, sharing not just fears about the immediate danger, but dreams for the future they wanted to build together. Jake spoke of expanding the ranch, maybe starting a family someday. Clara talked about the school she hoped to establish, the children she could teach. When this is over, Jake said as the night grew deep around them, will you marry me? Not because of some arrangement or advertisement, but because we choose each other. Clara's smile was radiant despite the tears on her cheeks. Yes. Yes, I choose you, Jake Harrison. In whatever time we have, in whatever comes, I choose you. They sealed their promise with a kiss that was gentle and sweet, full of love and hope despite the shadows gathering around them. When they finally went inside, Jake insisted on sleeping in the main room while Clara took his bedroom, the rifle close at hand. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, matching the heaviness in the air. Clara was preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Through the window, she saw 3 men riding toward the cabin with purpose and confidence that made her stomach twist with recognition. Jake, she called quietly. He appeared immediately, rifle in hand. Looking out the window, Clara's worst fears were confirmed. Robert Blackwood sat his horse like a man who owned everything he surveyed, his cold eyes fixed on the cabin. The two men with him looked like the kind of hired muscle that money could buy in any city. "That's him," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's Robert." Jake's expression was grim but determined. "Stay behind me. Whatever he says, whatever threats he makes, remember that you're not alone anymore." As the riders drew closer, Clara felt the life she had built here hanging in the balance. Everything she had come to love, this home, this man, this chance at happiness, was about to be tested by the worst of her past. But for the first time in her adult life, Clara Mitchell wasn't facing her demons alone. Beside her stood a man who loved her enough to fight for their future, and that made all the difference in the world. Robert Blackwood dismounted from his horse with the calculated movements of a man accustomed to intimidating others. He was well dressed in city clothes that looked out of place against the frontier landscape, his dark hair slicked back and his pale eyes scanning the ranch with obvious disdain. The two men flanking him remained mounted, hands resting near their gun belts with practiced ease. Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready, his body positioned between Clara and the approaching threat. Clara stood behind him in the doorway, her heart pounding but her chin raised with newfound courage. "Mr. Harrison, I presume," Robert called out, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who usually got his way. "I'm Robert Blackwood from Philadelphia. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Can't say I do," Jake replied evenly. "Everything on this ranch belongs to me or is here by my invitation." Robert's smile was cold as winter. "Come now, let's not play games. Clara Mitchell owes me a considerable debt, one that can only be satisfied through marriage and service. I have the legal documents right here." He patted his coat pocket. "Surely a reasonable man like yourself wouldn't want to harbor a debtor fleeing her obligations." Clara stepped forward slightly, finding her voice. "Those documents are forgeries, and you know it. I never signed anything that would bind me to you." Robert's eyes fixed on her with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. "Clara, darling, you're clearly confused. Perhaps this frontier life has addled your thinking. Come with me now, and we can put this unfortunate episode behind us." "The lady's made her position clear," Jake said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "She's staying here of her own free will. I suggest you mount up and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Robert's facade of politeness slipped, revealing the cruelty beneath. "I don't think you understand the situation, Cowboy. Clara belongs to me, legally and morally. Her father owed me money, and she agreed to work off that debt as my wife. If you're harboring her, you're interfering with a legal contract." "Funny thing about legal contracts," came a new voice from behind Robert's group. Sheriff Morrison rode into view with 3 deputies, all armed and looking serious. "They have to be legitimate to be enforced." Robert turned, his confidence wavering slightly. "Sheriff, I presume? I have all the necessary paperwork to claim what's mine." Sheriff Morrison dismounted slowly, his weathered face skeptical. "Do you now? Well, I've been doing some checking of my own since you arrived in town. Sent some telegrams to Philadelphia. Interesting thing about those documents you're carrying."
What are you implying?
"I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." The sheriff's voice was flat and authoritative. "There's no record of any legal debt agreement between Clara Mitchell and you. Furthermore, I found records of several complaints filed against you for harassment and intimidation of young women. Seems you have a pattern of manufacturing debts to force marriages." Robert's face flushed with anger. "Those are lies. I have witnesses, documentation, forged documentation, and paid witnesses," the sheriff interrupted. "The judge who supposedly validated your claim? Turns out he was disbarred 6 months ago for taking bribes." "Your whole story falls apart under examination, Blackwood." Clara felt weak with relief. But Robert wasn't finished. His hand moved toward his coat, and Jake immediately raised his rifle. "I wouldn't," Jake said quietly. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." Robert's hands stilled, but his eyes burned with rage. "This isn't over. Clara knows what she owes me. If not money, then something else." The implication in his words made Jake take a step forward, his finger moving to the rifle's trigger. "That sounds like a threat to me, Sheriff." "It surely does." Morrison nodded to his deputies, who moved to flank Robert's group. "Mr. Blackwood, you and your associates are no longer welcome in Willowbrook. You have 1 hour to collect your things and leave town. If I see you in my county again, you'll be arrested for harassment and attempted extortion." Robert's composure cracked completely. "You have no right. She belongs to me. Her father is dead." Clara said, stepping fully onto the porch beside Jake. His debts died with him, and I never agreed to anything you're claiming. I'm a free woman, and I choose to stay here with the man I love. The declaration seemed to break something in Robert. He lunged forward, pushing past one of the horses toward the porch. You're mine. You've always been mine. Jake moved faster than Clara had ever seen anyone move. His rifle butt connected with Robert's jaw, dropping him to his knees in the dirt. The two hired men reached for their guns, but the sheriff's deputies were faster, covering them before they could draw. That's assault, Robert gasped, blood trickling from his split lip. That's protecting my future wife from a man making threats, Jake corrected coldly. You came onto my property uninvited, made claims you can't support, and lunged at a woman under my protection. I'd call that self-defense. Sheriff Morrison hauled Robert to his feet roughly. Like I said, Blackwood, 1 hour to leave town. If you're smart, you'll keep riding until you cross state lines. As the sheriff and his men escorted Robert and his companions away, Jake and Clara stood together on the porch, watching them disappear. Clara felt as though a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but she also felt strangely hollow, as if she couldn't quite believe the nightmare was really over. Is it really finished? She asked quietly. Jake set his rifle aside and pulled her into his arms. It's finished. He has no legal claim on you. No moral claim. Nothing. You're free, Clara. Completely free. She buried her face against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. I was so afraid he would take me away from you, from this life we're building. Never. Jake's arms tightened around her. I told you once that I'd never let anyone take you away from here. I meant it. That afternoon, news of the confrontation spread through Willowbrook like wildfire. Neighbors and friends came by to check on them, bringing food and words of support. Mrs. Patterson arrived with a basket of fresh bread and a fierce expression. Good riddance to bad rubbish, she declared firmly. Clara, dear, you found your home here, and we won't let anyone disturb that.
The outpouring of community support overwhelmed Clara.
These people barely knew her, yet they had stood ready to defend her right to choose her own life. It was more than her blood relatives had ever done. As evening approached and the last of the well-wishers departed, Jake and Clara found themselves alone on their porch again. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, and the peaceful sounds of the ranch seemed especially sweet after the day's tension. Jake, Clara said softly, about what I said earlier, about you being the man I love. He turned to her with a slight smile. Having second thoughts? Never. She took his hands in hers. But I want to say it properly, without anger or fear clouding the words. I love you, Jake Harrison. I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see the best in people. I love the life we're building together, and I love the man you've helped me become. Jake's smile deepened. And I love you, Clara Mitchell. Your courage, your intelligence, the way you've brought warmth and laughter to this place. You've made my house into a home. So what happens now? She asked. Now we build the life we've been dreaming about. We get married, properly this time, with the whole town invited. We expand the ranch, start that school you've been thinking about, maybe add some children to the family when we're ready. Clara's heart swelled with joy. That sounds perfect. There's one more thing, Jake said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box that looked worn with age. This was my mother's ring. I know we talked about marriage, but I want to do this right. He dropped to one knee on the porch, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the last light of the sunset. Clara Mitchell, will you marry me? Not because of advertisements or arrangements, but because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life making you happy.
Clara's eyes filled with tears of pure joy.
Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Jake Harrison, I'll marry you. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. As Jake stood and kissed her gently, Clara felt the last piece of her fractured heart slide into place. She was no longer a frightened woman running from her past. She was Clara Harrison to be, beloved and protected, ready to build a future filled with love and purpose. 3 months later, on a crisp September morning, the Willowbrook Church was packed with friends and neighbors, celebrating the wedding of Jake Harrison and Clara Mitchell. Clara wore a new dress made from fabric Jake had special ordered from Denver, and her hair was adorned with late summer wildflowers picked from her own garden. As they exchanged vows in front of the whole community, Clara thought about the frightened woman who had stepped off the train not so many months ago. That woman had been looking for safety and survival. What she had found instead was love, belonging, and the courage to claim her own happiness. Sheriff Morrison had received word that Robert Blackwood had been arrested in Kansas for attempted fraud. He would not be bothering anyone for quite some time. The threat from Clara's past was truly finished. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the ranch, where tables laden with food filled the yard and music drifted across the prairie. As Clara danced with her new husband under the stars, she felt the deep contentment of someone who had found their forever home. "Any regrets, Mrs. Dead?" "Harrison?" Jake murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music. Clara smiled up at him, her eyes sparkling with joy and mischief. "Only one." "What's that?" "I regret that I was ever afraid to answer that advertisement. I should have known that any man who read poetry and built such a beautiful home would be worth the risk." Jake threw back his head and laughed, the sound rich and full of happiness. "Well then, Darlin, I guess we're both exactly where we're supposed to be." As the prairie wind carried the sounds of celebration across the vast landscape, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was home. Not just in this place, but in this life, with this man who had seen past her fears to the strength and love beneath. The mail-order bride who had arrived fearful and desperate was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and had found someone who cherished it. And when Jake whispered "I love you" in her ear as they danced, Clara whispered back the truth that would guide them through all their tomorrows. "And I love you, now and always." Their story had begun with an advertisement and a desperate hope, but it would continue with the kind of deep, abiding love that transforms two separate lives into one beautiful shared future. Under the endless prairie sky, Jake and Clara Harrison danced toward their happily ever after, knowing that whatever challenges life might bring, they would face them together.